I am a board member here at ESS and a digital artist, and I'm excited to have this conversation about NFTs and contemporary art. I've got two incredibly brilliant guests today, and we've got Delinda and Buki. Delinda, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am Delinda Collier, and I am from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and we partner with ESS a lot. We love them and have worked with them for years. I am a professor of art history there and interim grad dean. So my work is on technology and crypto cultures and things like that. So super excited to be here with my friend and former colleague, Buki.
Hi, y'all. My name is Olubukola Gbadegesin. I am at St. Louis University, where I am associate professor in art history and also in African American studies. Very interested in photography and just contemporary art and just contemporary conversations about art. Really interested in this conversation, so I'm excited to get it going.
Awesome. It's been amazing getting to know you guys through the process of prepping for this talk. And, it's such a humongous topic. There's like a slice we could try to take and get into for an hour, and it wouldn't even, come close to being comprehensive because it's just such a massive thing. You've got blockchain technology, cryptocurrency, and then NFTs, and each one in itself is a humongous topic. I think it's important to give a little bit of like some landscape stuff and just give an idea of, where we're at and what we maybe even some terms we might use in talking about it today, just to kind of bring everybody into what's happening. In the past couple of years with the rise of NFTs, we've also seen a rise in different platforms and possibilities for independent artists to get into the space and really disintermediate what's been going on with art, kind of getting more close to connecting with the sale and getting collectors and folks to be able to have a transaction. And we talk about transactions on the blockchain, and it's important that folks understand that, the smart contract and the transparency of these transactions is what makes them extremely special. And there's art that lives on the blockchain as well. And I think it's important to mention too that, generative art and digital art in general, there weren't a lot of avenues and spaces for these things to be able to play in the contemporary art space. Up until now, it was very difficult, from my own experience, in the screens that I have behind me and shows, 12 and 13 years ago, to fabricate an object to be able to sell digital art was one of the only real possibilities you had to be able to be inside of the gallery space. So it's opening up a lot of possibility for artists now. And it's been incredible to also have the ability to support those, over the last few decades that have been artists that have been inspiring and making work that has, kind of created an entire generation of folks coming up and continuing these traditions and bringing new technologies into the way that they create work. I think it's important. We also talk a little bit about, the undeniable conversation around climate crisis and NFTs. And I want to make mention of it because we're going to do our Q&A after this, and it's certain to come up, and it should. It's an important topic, and I think there's a lot that we need to do to continue to save our planet. That said, there are clean cryptocurrencies. There are different avenues that independent artists use to carbon offset their work. There are tons of opportunities to do this in an incredibly ethical and mindful way. But there's also a lot of conversation around it because it is a very provocative conversation and one that changes the narrative to the negative, which also doesn't take into account, the detrimental aspects of the fiat currency system and credit card transactions and the volume of computers and industry that support that entire infrastructure as well. So, I want to, talk a little bit, Delinda, with you about extraction and, what extractive capitalism means and kind of how you see this current model and this current world within NFTs playing into that as a continuum.
Right. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up, the ethics issue, because between fiat currency and crypto, I think we do have a rare chance to discuss, regimes and how they come up and how they become naturalized in a way. Because I think it's important that we pay attention to the climate, obviously, and to do that with a backwards view too, like you said, and to what comes before it. And by the way, how crypto kind of grafts onto these previous currencies, because it's not as if those are going to evaporate anytime soon. So it's kind of a multiverse of economies that we have now. But I think it's important as we get into the discussion of crypto, where I come into this and what my interest is in crypto cultures and its historical roots. And when have people needed to hide? When have they needed to encrypt things? When have they needed to be not surveilled, not seen? And how does that kind of play into currencies? And then, like you said, Kim, the extractive economies that have been just a part of modern capitalism, and they're formative of modern capitalism. So I think, yeah, the crypto aspect, the fungibility of the NFT, the non-fungible token, this historical term for exchangeability, and how that came about also with the slave trade, and when people became fungible, when they became tradable. And it's interesting that at that moment is when art became so important for the economy also, to create uniqueness or to create a non-fungible aspect. So I think there's a lot of slippage here between old and new regimes, and how we talk about money and people and bodies and extraction. So that's a whole lot. There's a whole lot wrapped up into that ball.
Yeah, there's so much in there. I'd love to hear a little bit about, what you were saying about, identities when people need to hide.
Mm-hmm.
There's something so interesting to me with crypto and NFT art, where you have these transactions that are pushing the transparent. They're pushing for the open exchange, but at the same time, the ID is so anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
So you have such a strong polarizing, reality of what you can know and what you can't know.
Yeah. Right.
Does that?
It
Go
makes
ahead.
sense. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's, that's always the benefit that believers of crypto will put forward, is that it's transparent, that it's absolute. That word gets used a lot too, that it's an absolute log or chronology or accounting for transactions, which is great. But yeah, the people behind that's the part that's hidden, right? And I think that's the part that some people see as also part of its revolutionarity, or I don't know if that's a word, but that's part of its promise, right? That one doesn't need to be identified by this. And so, but that's the slippage. There's the slippage there between what is known, what's not known, what's surveilled, what's not surveilled. And this feeds totally into that history of the movement of bodies with capital.
That's so interesting. Buki, when we were talking the other day, you mentioned this like new upper middle class, or like upper class, that was coming into Nigeria through the crypto space. That's such an interesting distinction to have, like a crypto class, folks that are specifically playing in that space. Do you see connections between what Delinda is saying and that specific cultural happening?
I mean, absolutely. I think that even here in the US, and my interests are primarily, creatives of color and also the global South. But I think even here in the US, you tend to see the conversations and the activity around crypto happening within a particular elite class, elite financial class. And so when you move into places like Nigeria, which has one of the fastest growing crypto economies, but the government there is cracking down on these transactions, in a misguided effort to kind of slow down the devaluation of the currency, of the local currency. They're limiting how many Bitcoin transactions the central bank can facilitate. And in response, folks are kind of flocking to these person-to-person platforms like Paxful that cut out the banks entirely, right? And these are also being used in NFT transactions in the Nigerian art world, in the African art world, right? African art market, which even though crypto is such a growth area, these are still restricted to elite populations. You know, they're restricted to elite artists who are able to sort of figure out how to make it work, how to sync it with their existing practices, and how to build out structures or infrastructure that can, facilitate kind of getting out their tokens or getting out their NFTs, marketing them in a particular way. People tend to have connections with international galleries, international museums that help to amplify their projects, right? And they have social media presences. So it's sort of a class of artists and a class of collector that is not necessarily, on that popular level, right? And one of the things that I kind of contrasted it with when we were talking yesterday was, if you look at the US, an example in the US is like, hip hop artists like Nas, who just recently released NFT tokens of streaming royalties of 2 of his songs. And, his release was definitely a bit different than other examples out there because, first of all, his were priced relatively affordably compared to the other outrageous NFT releases we've seen, in recent time. And his tokens also give his public or his fan investors sort of a chance to earn money on the royalties of his songs as they're streamed over time. So ultimately, this kind of generated shared revenue between artists and fans in a way that you don't necessarily see with, some of the more direct transactions between collectors and artists, visual artists, for instance. What Nas is doing is kind of like this co-creative, co-generative project that I think is really fascinating. And so, yeah, I think that to me is more speaking towards kind of the subversive potential of crypto and the subversive potential of NFTs by extension. And you tend to lose some of that when you restrict that activity to that elite population, that elite class that we're talking about. And so I see sort of the promise of crypto and the promise of NFTs being its possibilities in the popular realm, right? How it can be sort of extended into this populist conversation. A third example, and a really much more fraught one, is in El Salvador, where the country has really declared Bitcoin as legal tender, right? They bought up hundreds of Bitcoins and launched this national virtual wallet called Chivo. In the country, which is, already known as a land of volcanoes, is already, is trying to mine Bitcoin by harnessing geothermal energy. So the geothermal energy of those volcanoes, and so it's using renewable energy and sort of this minimal carbon footprint. You already see a little bit of this happening in Iceland, but for the first time, we're seeing it happening in the global south, like in a really, populist push, right? Now, the president, Bukele, is also, consolidating power and eroding democratic protections in a real way. So it really remains to be seen sort of how progressive this effort will ultimately be in the larger scheme of things. But it's still something to keep an eye on, and it still kind of evokes that idea of sort of the populist potential and the subversive potential of crypto and NFTs, by extension to Nas and what's going on in Nigeria as well. So there's definitely a lot of possibilities here. And yeah, I'm really excited by it, especially for what's to come as much as what's already happened.
Same. I love the Nas example so much. I think it's more widely known and accepted, and just kind of one of those status quo things of just how predatory the music industry is. And it's one of those things. What we've seen happen to the music industry, we're foolish to think isn't coming for us as digital artists and visual artists. In the same way that people are like, well, why would you buy a JPEG when you can have it for free? All of those people, to me, are people who are streaming music and not paying for it. It is the same idea of, access versus value. And there are so many different ways to include your audience in that revenue share on a way that is really impactful. So it's really exciting to me, like, to hear of Nas doing that, just because it's like, if you're going to stream that song 20 times because you love that song,
Right.
why wouldn't you just buy this NFT and be getting, you know what I mean? Like, you're like, I
Right.
believe in this hit. There are
Right.
tons of songs that I've heard. I'm like, I believe in this hit. I would put money down on the future of this band or the future of this label. And it really, when we think about decentralized finance and we think about transparent smart contracts, those are the kinds of places, at least from my perspective, where things get really, really interesting, where, you could buy a ticket to a concert, and if there's a recording of that concert, you're a shareholder. You helped create the audience element for it, and be able to have that be something that lives with you and is also having value, gaining or losing value, depending on what that artist does, whether they, become canceled and cringy, or they become, some kind of global sensation. That could be, something that you're able to, financially connect into. I'm looking forward to those kinds of micro transactional scales.
How much of this, I mean, since you brought it up, how much of this is related to digital rights management and notions of private property and intellectual property? I think what Nas is doing is sort of taking that aspect of intellectual property and making it public, or including his public into that, which is super interesting. But again, I'm wondering if all of those aspects of the NFT are based on, again, this previous regime of private property and relying on kind of that thing that seems to be at the heart of capital. And I guess arguably, if you're concerned about capital, about the way that it's kind of taken things and commodified them in certain ways.
Right. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a lot of this that has to do with intellectual property. And I think it really has to do with how artists approach, the way that they use NFTs and the ways that they deploy it in their work. I think particularly for artists of color, there is a long, long history of exploitation that I think, parallels in some ways the realities of other artists, but also, even extends beyond it, right? Because artists of color, whether they're visual artists or musicians, have been historically kind of disenfranchised when it comes to contractual negotiations or contractual relationships with larger entities, whether it's their managers or the corporations or music industries that kind of support them. And so I think that this particular example, it's different, much different from what, I see Snoop doing. Snoop Dogg is doing something that's much more kind of mainstream along the lines of NFTs. I think Nas is kind of a little bit more subversive and sort of plugging into this co-creative community from which the music itself kind of emerges, right? And tapping back into that community to say, reinvest in this music, reinvest in the very work that is generated out of these shared experiences of community, and doing it in such a way that it recirculates capital through those communities, as opposed to allowing capital to reproduce itself in these existing extractive and problematic structures that it's always existed in. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's clever. I just worry with a lot of, I'm not necessarily worried about Nas's project, but with all of these, and I think what people are also worried about with NFTs is again the symbolic gesture of things versus the actual real. For instance, we were all talking about how many people will actually make it as NFT artists, and how many people will actually see a return on that investment. The predatory nature of NFTs, I think, is well known. But with all of these things, I just worry that they remain in the realm of the symbolic. Even the smart contract can be that way. And the art world has a way of doing that, where it churns out a lot of these symbols that pretend to be utopian, but then end up just right back into that kind of nasty swirl of what becomes popular and what's immediately dismissed and things like that. I'm thinking of, and this is, just kind of a related artist, Devin Kenny, who had a show at PS1 in 2019 where he installed blockchain on their computers and had it mine. I'm forgetting which coin it was, but had it running the whole time that his exhibition was up. And then he donated that money to an immigrant bail bond. And so he's making these very direct connections to carceral culture and people of color who get targeted. And like you're saying, Buki, people who always fall on the dark sides of contracts, and addressing those things. But again, I'd really be interested. Maybe I should just ask him how much money that made and how much he was able to donate. What are the kind of returns on this? And maybe that's just a pessimistic side of considering this, but.
Yeah, I mean, that would be an interesting point. That'd be an interesting conversation because, I mean, even with that, like uploading a blockchain or trying to mine on a computer, you still tap into those questions of like, the carbon footprint and like what exactly is being produced versus being extracted from that process.
Yeah.
So even though ultimately the Bitcoin or whatever is mined from that goes into this great cause, you still have kind of this on the other side of it with the carbon footprint. You still have this issue of like there's something else there's a different price that's being paid. On another level.
Totally. What am I doing and why am I doing it? And I think that's understanding the prices that are paid for any action is in my opinion one of the big wake ups culturally for us right now and moving forward, understanding, and I think this is something that is in the major dialogue more now than ever before, understanding supply chain, understanding where resources come from. When you hit buy now, what are all the things that happen on the other side of that button before that box shows up? Because it's I think there's a very immediate transaction economy, and understanding some of that is much more difficult than understanding just like a computer mining and like electricity, right? Like it's really easy to poke that one when we don't want to look at or discover or understand some of the complexities with how sourcing and supply chain works globally across every single thing that we use and touch.
Every single thing. Yeah. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that people, including myself, are so, quick to say, I don't want to participate in that, because we have the choice to not participate in Bitcoin, at least for now. But we don't have the choice whether to participate in fiat economies or, whether I get direct deposit instead of, a paycheck. All of these things run without our control. And I think, again, as this kind of transition is happening or this grafting is happening, we have the chance to have the conversation, which I think is important. But at the same time, to realize that there's so little of this that we can control, and this extraction economy is not slowing. In fact, as it transitions into, the low carbon alternatives, there are other problems with those too, the battery reliant technologies and things like that.
One of the things, and I didn't raise this when we were talking before, but one of the things that I'm really curious about is if this crypto economy can really usurp what is existing. And as somebody who's an art historian, I kind of hesitate to put this out there, but a part of me feels like even the fact that it is manifesting this way in the art market makes me think that it's already kind of co-opted. So I'm putting that out there with like a caveat, don't crucify me, but it is a concern because this is, the art market is not known for its accessibility
or its ethics.
or its ethics. And For all the, crypto proponents will, you know, for all they've said about their intentions to, have this, transparent economy, this kind of utopic vision of, global finance, I really wonder, like, what the ultimate, or what the possibilities are with this crypto project or this crypto experiment, based on just kind of the path that it's taking um, into visibility, you know?
Yeah, Kim, maybe if you could tell us more about the way that your career has been shaped or the way you've shaped it through these various technologies.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm definitely just a very dipping of a toe person when it comes to the crypto world. A lot of the work that I make utilizes analog video and analog video technology and hybridization of that within digital models to build video systems and performance-based video systems improvisationally in nature. You know, for me, it's always been a very tenuous and difficult situation to participate in the capital A art world. Being a digital artist and having not taken the conventional, large BFA to large MFA to large representation gallery to large museum premiering, it has been very difficult. But when I left university in 2003, it was a very different world. It was difficult to have conversations with galleries about hanging up televisions on the wall. That was a difficult and controversial thing. And at the same time, that made the sustainability of living as an artist very, very difficult. And to be honest, in the digital art world, I think for most, if not many, it is a very difficult thing to find yourself being able to sustain doing, actual true artwork, and I say that because there are so many folks that are unbelievably phenomenal artists, and the majority of their income and their ability to sustain is based on brand partnerships. And that's been this like kind of, this kind of gross reality of commissioned work by brands that need to create media assets that digital artists have really had to focus on and play in because they didn't have a vehicle to tap into, and collectors didn't have a way to be able to authenticate and guarantee their ability to bring those artists into their collections. Um, and that's something, there was no track for that. It was like, the folks that, I came up, the whole internet was different, like we were building stuff in Flash and making CD-ROMs, and it was just a whole different world a few decades ago. And the folks that, were at that stage ahead of me that were inspiring me and challenging me, they were at, the best of the best of the best. And it's like, oh, well, the best thing that you can get is the biggest brand contract, is to get, to get involved with some corporation that is going to underwrite your ability to build this visual work or build this installation or build this show. And don't get me wrong, it's made for an incredible landscape of opportunities and work. Companies like Red Bull have entire divisions that do phenomenal events, put out great art, great music. But that still doesn't allow for the artist getting awareness by this huge audience to be able to sustain and make sales and put out work and cultivate a following the way that they could if there was another vehicle for monetary transaction. And that, to be honest, has been one of the most inspiring things to see, or, some of the folks that I've come up, really, idolizing and being inspired by, and have been lucky enough, to meet and befriend folks like G Monk and Josh Davis and Brendan Dawes, Jentel Martin, that have this incredible voice, incredible body of work. And to see them in the past 24 months break out the ceiling of brand partnership work into truly building their work, their vision, and seeing it sell is the most hopeful thing as an artist that I've ever experienced in my life. Because everything else has told me, you know, you were going to work a day job every day in your life, so find one that you love, make the work that you want to make. No one's ever going to buy it because it's digital. So this is like, you know, a pretty massive shift from the way the narrative has been. And those folks continue to press it further, you know.
Can we dive a little bit into that because it's digital phrase? Is it because, and this is, we could go down a huge rabbit hole here, but I think it's important. It's an important circle back to the fungibility, because it's because it's digital means that it's ephemeral. It doesn't have kind of a material basis, and that it can be copied. You know, that's one of the anxieties about NFTs, or I think that's why people are puzzled, because the actual art isn't unique, right? But talk a little bit more about that, because it's digital phrase that you know somehow is tied to the ability to own or to create wealth from. You know, something that you create.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to even put into words, you know, like who is going to buy an image and where were they going to view it and enjoy it if it's just a file, you know, like that's such a replicatable entity as well, which is the difference between the blockchain being able to authenticate the ownership, and truly know that it is unique and that it holds the rights, as we were talking about earlier. You know, that's a big part of that. Are they reproduction rights? You know, if it's got audio, do you have publishing rights? Like there's so many different ways and systems to be able to both continue to own and use work as an artist, or sell and make completely available to a collector or buyer a piece of work. So that just didn't exist prior to that. You know, I have I have been in many situations trying to sell video artwork, and it is one of those things that people can love it all day long. But I've been asked by a number of people in my earlier days, you know, what do I do? Do I buy a DVD? Do I put it on my TV in my home? What do I do with this? Like, do I get a tape? You know, I've backed up a number of things to tapes, and I've sold analog tape backups, and I've sold, you know, smart drives with files on them, and DVDs with archival media. And it is unbelievably difficult and unbelievably rare that those things really ever happen. You know, and it's been inspiring too for me as an artist, you know, to both fabricate small monitors, but I've also moved into getting prints of my work made, both on silicon, on fabric, as well as you know, conventional, you know, canvas and paper. And that's been something, while I enjoy it, it is a much different process than, you know, my work in the studio and then being able to like upload the file and then it's done. You know, printing and editions, you get into a whole other wild world of things, and then you're doing something else. And then you're making posters. Then you're not making motion work, and you're not making video work, and you're also minimizing the scale of what it can be, because we have ability to do, you know, resolutions and things in digital that we just don't have the ability to do in the physical world.
It's fascinating hearing you talking about this, because I'm also thinking about, you know, when you said, you know, it's just a file, it immediately made me think about, you know, this metaverse conversation that we've had. Also, it's like this is how this digital artworks, and I think a lot of NFT tokens, that's the future of how they could be viewed. But it seems like, based on what you're saying, that folks in the art world kind of resist. They're resisting kind of thinking about these creative productions outside of these existing boxes of materiality, right? It's really difficult for folks to imagine, to envision kind of that future that NFTs and, you know, digital artists are kind of pushing us towards. It's like breaking out of material boxes, breaking out of materiality in a way. Which is again back to my point about, like, is the art market the place for, you know, these is the art market the place for these kind of innovations? Because it resists. It resists.
It resists. And, you know, I think the art, music, all of those industries, they're going to be resistant to it, but it's coming, you know, and it's a dimensional shift in how we view what is real and where we exist and how we communicate. And it is kind of a pretty big fundamental experience of living change that we're going through. And I think it's awesome that, you know, we're getting the opportunity to get another, because we've already had the taste of many metaverses and the reality of, you know, Second Lives and EverQuests and World of Warcrafts and all these other online portals of, you know, double lives that people have been able to have, because there are many, many metaverses. We're getting that at a time where we're living in a beyond expectation place, you know, many of us, where, you know, there are so many people whose lives were completely built around co-presence, and now they have telepresence. And we never thought we'd be able to do these jobs or have these, you know, life events or have these friendships that existed within this, you know, this way, within this portal, you know, getting together, you know, virtually. So it's exciting to me to think about that, because we're in desperate need of a massive paradigm shift, because, you know, all of the institutions are built on, you know, the terrible and illogical and small-minded things of folks, you know, hundreds of years ago and less. So it's definitely due time. So to what you were saying, Vicky, I think I'm hopeful that more folks start thinking about the art market, but building in a broader sense. You know, I've seen a couple of startups that are really focused on, you know, speed to set up a DAO, which I think is a really incredible organizational concept, which is a digital autonomous organization. I hope I did that right.
You did.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And it's like, that to me is so exciting, because, you know, I would love to work for a place that had pay transparency. I'm super comfortable with people making a ton more money than me, and I'm super comfortable with working hard to deserve what I deserve, and so forth. You know, I think it's a concept for collectivism that we've never really seen before, and it says that we trust one another, that we have agency, we have autonomy, but we also have accountability. And those things are really non-existent in like any kind of business or institutional setting. You know, like that's just not something that we've ever culturally seen before. So just the experience of organizations like that starting to build up, and the speed at which you can now activate them, because there are folks focused on building within the blockchain these different things, that's my hope. And then the art world can come and be like, oh, this is a good developer.
Right.
I'm going to build on top of this technology. You know,
Come
like
and co-opt it. Yeah.
That's my hope.
The DAO space is really interesting to me, because I think that was the first time that I sort of understood how it could bridge into, you know, quote unquote real space, or actually feed back into gestures that we want to make permanent, that maybe protect our resources, you know, that you can write a DAO or a contract, you know, because it's just a series of if then, you know, mechanisms, right? So if this, then this. And doing that, you know, I've seen people talk about writing perpetual rights, or giving a stream the rights that a human has, or giving, you know, a piece of land the same contractual, you know, I don't want to say personhood, because it's not even based on that. It's just based on the if then mechanism of this contract. And I think that's really special. You know, that evens out a lot of things and makes a lot of things possible that we couldn't do because of our very limited understanding of what a contract is and what has to be involved for one to be put into place, like personhood or autonomy, or, you know, or the full person or the full citizen, which we know it doesn't extend to all citizens of the earth or all people, right? And hasn't historically.
Absolutely. It levels that playing field in a really important way, and it creates that that continuum over time, which is like one of the great things about technology is that, we can build and we can plan, but it outlives us. It has a continuum that is so much further beyond us. And in the NFT space is one of the this very sweet and resonant things that I heard early on was, Josh Davis, a digital artist, talk about, the rights to his work and being able to create work that as it continued to sell over time would be able to support his children and potentially their children, after he's gone, because those are things that have value, and that kind of rights and royalties should be respected and baked into contracts. But we so often don't have the ability to do that as like lay people. The technology opens up the possibility to create and construct business and transactions in this very important and different way.
Yeah, I mean, I think if anything, it does acknowledge the realities of exploitation and of trust and non-trust and things like that, but it builds it into almost like a backstop system where, and that's where you would, I think, see the anonymity being very important, because then, conceivably, and again, this is in the perfect world, one person with a lot of power wouldn't be able to disrupt that. Now, whether that happens or not, I'll be really interested to see, because we've already seen, Kim, you mentioned to us, there were already some cases where things weren't working out according to the contract, right?
Yeah. There's been like people reporting, royalties not moving and things like that. But that gets into the platform conversation of like, there are folks that, they're minting things, and these platforms have come up so quickly, and there's so many of them. And some of them are curated and folks have to apply. Some of them is just like any old buddy can mint a thing. And, we're moving faster than we're capable of building and securing. So things like, knowing that the files and the structure are sound, that the technology is sound, like we're so on that, that bleeding edge. It's difficult to have that. It is very much, that Wild West moment in this technology where there's not a ton of regulation. It's very community regulated. It's a lot of, discords with different people trying to figure out what's happening across multiple places and multiple channels. And it's very community controlled. There's been a lot of folks with issues of other people minting their artwork or, referential artwork and things like that people have had disputes about. And for the most part, it seems like, the internet is trying to police itself. The entities of the internet, the Twitter users and Discord users are, trying to keep the culture and the community healthy. It's a hard thing to do. So speaking about doubts, one of the things, Delinda, that I thought was so strange inside the space, and I feel like there's tons of opportunity for folks to like, play in different ways. But I saw the artist Shepard Fairey, who's so phenomenal and like has done so much prolific, important work and political work. And Shep launched a bunch of NFTs, but at the same time, it's like, what are you doing when you could be changing your factories and changing, the business of Obey to be able to work on the blockchain and actually do something to connect how DAOs and labor can kind of meet in this really important place where, cryptocurrency and blockchain can, change and turn on its head the way that we operate businesses, to be able to give art royalties to the factory artists that are, working to build your art, feels like one of the most reasonable and easy ways to enter into that conversation and that space organically, instead of just, minting for the sake of grabbing onto something that's happening. I'm hopeful that we'll see more of that. I like to ask folks if they think that Andy Warhol would have had the factory as a DAO. What do you guys think? Yeah,
he's the original DAO. He's the original. Well, I don't know. Original's a funny word, first of all. Second of all, you
or
could
Andy Warhol for sure.
Right. Yeah. You could trace back. You could go to Duchamp, I think, in some ways, but Andy Warhol definitely, I think, is a touchstone for this, because if anybody figured out the smart contract of the art world, it was, and exposed it, it was him, and I think precipitated a bunch of, oh no, this is the end of art kind of essays and things. But what he figured out, which I think is really key to this, is that the art didn't matter. It really wasn't the art that mattered. It was the celebrity. It was the mechanisms that kind of surround all of that mattered. And so I think what we're seeing here, and I think, by the way, that's why a lot of people are suspicious of NFTs.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, absolutely. I think it's one of those things that, like, unless you're in the art world, you don't really understand how, like, inflated and, strange the entire kind of way, like, things are when they use the term, like, oh, that's at market, like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
that could go to market, like, that's in market right now. Like, those are, I think, concepts that, folks that aren't collectors or artists, like, they're not plagued with that reality.
Right.
Is that something that y'all could talk a little bit about, of how you see, the inflated art market and the way that people are kind of interpreting and seeing the NFT space right now?
We were texting about this when this whole thing first started. Like, this was my pandemic, like, guilty pleasure. I was just following
Right.
hype. Like, what is happening? But one of the funniest things that I saw were these interviews with collectors, and particularly like collectors at big places like big galleries, Sotheby's, when they were at the very beginning still trying to kind of figure out how to respond to it, and they were panicked, but also really defensive, and a little bit like antagonistic towards this whole idea of NFTs, because I don't think they had really wrapped their minds around how to talk about it in the same way that they talked about kind of mainstream creative production. And it didn't have the same excuse me, it didn't have the same ownership potential, or, like, potential for provenance, for tracking provenance, that kind of established, like, historical artworks did. I think that there's just a lot of tension around where exactly the authority lies in making those decisions and making those determinations around, what exactly is the pricing for this? What exactly does art market mean for digital artwork, specifically NFTs, right? So I think digital artworks have sort of been absorbed to some extent, maybe not as broadly as they ought to be, but they've been sort of absorbed by the existing art market to some extent. But NFTs were still, at that point, still very new, and I think to some extent still new. But now Sotheby's has, like, its own metaverse, and they're developing spaces to exhibit, NFTs in a non-material way, right? So it's starting to kind of blend. It's starting to kind of leak into those institutions, those art institutions or art market institutions. Even though I'm still a little skeptical about how much you'll see, how much more they'll develop and grow in those spaces. So, and I'm curious to hear what you thought, Delinda.
Yeah, exactly. I think, the first time I saw NFTs at art fairs, I was like, well, yeah, of course, I think, and it was about the time that everybody started the eye roll about it, and why everybody's so skeptical about it, because it fits exactly into the model of the art world. But I think what Kim was saying was so important with this, it can't graft, or it can, and it will graft onto this previous exploitative economy. But that will be the worst kind of manifestation of this. And it will be the hype that everybody is annoyed by. But the real power of these things, because they are powerful mechanisms, the real power will be when people use them ethically to kind of reform and be transparent about how that all works anyway. And there's no end to the applications of that could, reside on every level of our society if we let it. But that's what I worry about, is that, since it's made such a splash in the art market, and the art market loves an empty symbol, and I worry that it will, on the one hand, be exploited that way, but on the other hand, to be dismissed by a lot of folks who might be talked into using this as a tool of transparency, or a way to build new systems.
That's interesting. And like, what do you think about there's been all these interesting conversations about cryptocurrency being used in these, like, at Sotheby's and these major houses, but I feel like art has been historically such a world for the cash transaction, such a way to be able to, collect something.
And launder money.
Favorite topic. This is my favorite.
Essentially money laundering. Yes.
The free ports, the art free ports. This is like when that first, I'm sorry. I just had a Tourette's moment, but
go for it.
The art free ports were like kind of a precursor to this, in my opinion, I think. And they amplified what is already at the core of the art market, the relationship between art and economy, and art and capital, in a way that I think folks have been effacing for quite some time. Like folks have been just kind of overlooking and dismissing. And I think even with the free ports particularly, I'm not sure if folks know what free ports are, if it's worth explaining.
Tell us, explain it just for a second.
But basically, free ports, not specifically art free ports, but free ports, there are several in different ports all over the world. So a free port is basically a tax-free zone that is sort of a transition zone between countries, where there is no tax, there's very little regulation, and you can basically hide assets, material assets and commodities. So you can hide them with no visibility and no government to come poking around. Although that's sort of changing a little bit now with that Mugniani issue, but we'll come back to that. So the free ports were being used by moneyed elite to hide things like artwork, like $1 million artwork, in a way that they pay taxes on it, and they can just kind of archive it or vault it for future sale or resale or liquidation of assets whenever necessary. They can hide it from spouses in divorce cases. They can hide it from the government. So these free ports have been sort of used as global vaults all over. So there's one in Zurich, there's one in New York, there's one in LA. There are a few. There's one in London. I'm not sure where else, but they're all over. Hong Kong, I think, has one now. Singapore has one now, I think, but they're all over. And so you can actually move your assets from free port to free port. You don't have to ever land it in any particular national space or national jurisdiction. And so this idea of like this tension between visibility and opacity, right? Of like, that such and such might have bought, or this object or this artwork might have been bought at auction on this date. But until it's actually resold, you never know who actually bought it. And until it's actually resold, anybody can, acquire it and keep it sort of hidden in a free port. So it's just kind of hidden assets. And I think something similar might be happening with NFTs as well. I think there's some level, there's a level of visibility, but also opacity with this. And I think that it's sort of moving into the realm of like materiality. I think the free ports are kind of like this no man's land where you might know it's there, but you can't ever really confirm that it's there. Like similarly with like digital art, it's like we know it's real. You can't touch it, but we know it's real.
And we know that somebody owns it. We just don't know who that owner. Yeah.
Exactly. So there's this interesting parallel of like this existential parallel of like materiality. Where is it exactly? We don't know, but it exists. So That's my
It's interesting. It's
feel
interesting
about
to hear about that because the way that you're describing like this reports and art, that exists on a scale that is like, you know, for oligarchs and, generational
Yeah.
wealth families where, we have the ability to be anonymous and put our NFTs in our wallets and have our cryptocurrency on like a teeny tiny scale. Like
Yep.
you could have, you could be a $50 dollionaire, like just have a couple of little NFTs that you're
Yeah.
just squirreling away because you love them.
Yes.
But operate in that same way and be able to have access to a system like that.
That's right.
Which has never, I can't even imagine, any other analog to that would have existed that, an everyday person would have access to. It's an interesting thing to hear about. I can't imagine. I want to find one, but I feel like that's never going to happen. Open us up, Delinda, and take us through some of that inflated value stuff, because it's one of those things that I feel like people don't really understand, like how much of that value is inflated and manufactured. And like, NFTs are, new and all the rage. So they get, put up and, chastised for all of the hype factory, ness of it. But it's not too dissimilar to what has already been the existing practice, right?
That's right. And, I mentioned Warhol, but around that time, I often take my students back to, the moment in the 60s and 70s where currencies were detached from any real value. I mean, there was the first step of the gold standard and the currency that we have being detached from the gold standard. But then there was a second kind of more global decentralization of currency that happened in the 60s and 70s. That shifted everything. And remember, this is the post-colonial moment. This is when, decolonization has happened. And so there are new ways to manipulate that currency that are being thought up by the global North, and specifically America and, a few other countries and corporations and things like that. So the moment that happens, I think a lot of artists recognize that their artwork was also part of that whole system of inflationary values, or, that it could be used in a mechanism that was not unlike the stock market, where things are hyped and then dumped. And so that whole process of manipulating value and manipulating what somebody holds, because it's all symbolic at that point, I think becomes something that's not only practiced, but then recognized by artists. And there's a deep, deep sense of skepticism and cynicism about that. And you can debate forever whether Warhol and others were aware, or whether they reveled in it, or whether they were criticizing it. It doesn't matter, right? The fact was that these were the conditions of art making by the late 20th century. So I think the way that happens, and the way so NFTs are the way, in a sense, that people are trying to correct that by creating a quote unquote real value to that exists on the blockchain, right? That verification system, that absolute chronological or log, that exists independent of anybody's manipulation. But they also, then we see, are being used in the same kind of logic as, when we talk about like meme art, really bad meme art. It's doing a lot of that kind of mimicking, but also participating in that inflation of value. So it's like an ethicless world, but as you were saying, Kim, that's existed for a long time when it comes to money and value. And again, I would trace that all the way back to the slave trade. I think there's some important literature that's coming out now that talks about how that was a fundamental shift in how people understood value, because it was no longer based on ethics, but it was based on capital. And the moment that a person or people get used to produce, not just in exchange, to be exchanged, but also to as credit, people are used as credit, essentially, for future returns and future gains. That's a fundamental shift in the way we understand value from an ethics proposition to purely profit. And so I think, that's the way I kind of make sense of it in my historical scheme. But I'm sure there's a lot of debate about that.
That's so interesting, to think about the relatability between that within the slave trade, and to think about that in terms of credit, and to think about that in terms of futures.
Yeah.
It's something that is going to stay with me, and I'm going to think about, because it's such an interesting, it's an important distinction in what's happening now, and how to really ensure the stewardship of fungibility versus non-fungibility, right? Like,
yeah,
it is this new avenue and this new, modality of technology within how we operate. So, within that, how do we steward it correctly to ensure that it doesn't become just another, dark web tactic for predatory practice, and, this strange kind of MLM system of art that seems to be coming up, I'd love to hear from you guys, some of your maybe hopeful predictions, or maybe some of your dystopian predictions, but just kind of like, where do you think this technology is going? Like, we're already so far beyond anywhere I thought we were about to be. So what do you guys think?
I'll let you go, Boki.
Mine is bleak. No, I mean, it's so, I have hopes. I have high hopes. Let me just start with that. I think that, like I was saying earlier, I really love the subversive potential of kind of crypto possibilities. I love that. And I think that it's all about approach, and there are folks who are approaching it with that mindset and with that spirit. As a whole, I think that we're still kind of at the tail end of, what was a very much like a Wild West and a hype culture that emerged around it. And I'm still seeing more evidence of that than not. I'm a little bit weirded out by what's going on with the metaverses and the different multiverses. I'm not sure quite where that's going, especially, like I said earlier, my interest being with creatives of color and the global South. I just see there being more and more separation, right? More and more. I'm not sure how to phrase this, but the difference of access that's amplified if we continue along the track. I mean, there's already kind of this technological divide. I think that this might just amplify it a little bit more. But I mean, there are possibilities like what's going on in El Salvador, and but also conversely, there are things like what's going on in Nigeria, where the federal government has no idea what NFTs are, and no idea about how to engage them or regulate them. And I think more often than not, that's the situation you'll find in the global South. And so without that sort of education, without that awareness of kind of what the potential of this crypto possibilities are, it's just, it leaves me worried and a little bit anxious.
It's funny.
I'll stay there.
It's funny because, and I'm not going to pick on you, Kim, but the question, the question is,
you can.
Okay, I'll use it as an example. But it often comes up like, what's going to happen in the future with this stuff? And it occurs to me that question is kind of indicative of this anticipation, or the kind of future predictions that people are always talking about when it comes to crypto. It's always like, what's this going to happen? What's this going to do in 10 years? What's this going to do next year? What's it going to do in 5 minutes? With the crashes and things that we're going through right now with crypto economies, and that anxiety about the future, I think, is telling of a present that's extremely chaotic, bordering on anarchist. and on a global scale. And I think we've noticed it a lot more with the pandemic, but all of these contracts that these kind of heritage contracts that we've been living with for generations and centuries, they're coming undone, and it's terrifying and it's exciting. So I think this whole state of emergency that we're in, where we know that things are emerging, but they're all sort of piecemeal and out of control. And, we also talked about the fact that there's many metaverses and they're not really connected. There's not like one that's out there that you connect into. And that's how the internet's always been. There wasn't one internet. So it's interesting. It's to me, I'm thinking about the present with this and how its imminence is going to play out, like what it's going to graft itself onto, what it is grafting itself onto now, and what it's doing to our everyday lives. How it's going to convert into opportunity, or what does that even mean? I guess opportunity, but yeah, like Buki is saying, is it really going to shape the way people around the world are able to tap into certain economies? I think so, probably. It already is, kind of like the micro banking and microloan industry in the early 2000s. I guess 90s it started, but that's my long answer to not answer your question.
I appreciate that as two historians getting asked about the future. That was
right.
personal delight of mine to get to do today. And I'll give you a little bit of my own, because you guys both touched on some things that I think are really important. And really topical is, like we are in this really chaotic present where things are being undone, and at the same time that there's all of this change and there's so much dismantling and disruption, we can choose to look at, without seeing it as like, a savior, but, looking at different modalities, technologies from the the digital sense all the way through the language sense and the structural sense of different technologies and approaches of thought that can change how we maneuver, because that divide that they all have been talking about, of the global north and the global south and the access, it's not going away, and it's not getting particularly better, right? And that's one of the things within kind of the crypto world is this almost utopian idea of globalization, and the question is, will there be enough momentum to actually have it flourish and blossom, or will it erupt into these many disparate dystopian little micro realities and universes? And it's one of those things as an artist that I've just get up every day and try to do the best that I can do, and vote with every dollar that I spend, whether it's fiat or crypto, and have these kinds of conversations of what can we do and how can we do it. Awesome. Thank you guys so much. This was so much fun today. Yeah. I know we're gonna take some questions as soon as we're done with this little portion. So hopefully we get some hot takes, and thank you guys for watching.
And thanks, ESS.
Yes, thank you, ESS. Thank you all.
Hello. Thank you. Hold on, let me get my screens good. Hello, I'm Olivia Janelle. I'm with Experimental Sound Studio. And I want to thank everyone for being here. It's been such a robust conversation in the chats, and we're excited to keep digging into it. And I want to thank most of all Delinda, Buki, and Kim for wading into this conversation. I know there are a lot of feelings on it, a lot of thoughts, and so we hope this is the beginning of more as well, because I think it's something that will definitely continue to evolve. I'm keeping an eye on the chats if anyone has more questions as we go, but I'm going to go back to some of the questions that we have had throughout the conversation. Delinda, did you want to start out with the question about the Laura Dickens had about the Jacobin article on cryptocurrencies?
Oh yeah, because I do remember reading that when it came out, and I think, if I recall, the argument is sort of what we talked about in terms of what this system of minting or wealth creation grafts onto in the already established financial world. And so the point of that article was, this disconnect between the utopian practices of smart contracts or NFTs and the financial system that we have now, and how that's created, who gets to, the gatekeepers of that, which they rightly point out, I think, are not going to go away.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're seeing a lot of governments reassert, their authority in some, right now, mild ways, but I think they could get less mild if they're pushed.
And that kind of leads into a couple of other questions that Laura had throughout the chat, I think, or connects to. One of them is, it sounds like a lot of the argument and thought here is that NFTs aren't as bad as previous systems, or as comparable to previously inequitable systems, banking, art world, etc. But is that enough?
That's a great question. What is enoughness? And I don't mean to just say that in a way that is flippant. I really mean that. I think that's something that is a very difficult struggle of us to figure out, us collectively as a global community, us as, a humanity, what is enough? Do we have our own sheep and we're spinning our own wool and we're knitting every pair of socks that we own? Is that enough? Will that be enough? Like there's a certain, a certain vacuum reality that we can talk about when it comes to enoughness, but then there are realities of inching forward and change that are actionable. So do we take an actionable change for betterness, even if it doesn't actually achieve enoughness? And that's one for me that I sit within that constant, like that conversation. I would love for there to be a hard reset and a group of super smart people to like create a new infrastructure. And I'd be willing to pause for the cause if that was going to happen. But I'm also here for a very small amount of time. That's the real reality of it. So, we've got to do what we can with what we got while we're here to do it.
And I would add to that and just say that I don't know if we know enough about NFTs and kind of what that system is gearing towards to be able to say whether or not it is different or better or any of these like adjectives. I think that there are enough similarities, there's enough ways that it's being grafted in different approaches, there's enough ways that it's being grafted to what's already existing. There's enough ways that it's, diverging from what already exists. And it's just its own beast. And so I don't know what, like Kim, I'm not sure exactly what enough to do what, but it's enough to have a conversation about it at the very least. That's what we're trying to do. I'm not judging it or trying to kind of like land on one side of either of it. I'm just kind of like poking the stick with a stick and trying to kind of figure out what it is. And so, I think that's about as much as I can commit to in terms of this conversation, but it's a very necessary one. And I think it's important to engage all these kind of innovations, especially technological innovations, as they're trying to figure out new kind of new ways of thinking about our world and new ways of thinking about our financial relations.
Yeah.
I just want to say too, just to piggyback onto that, I've been really impressed and everything with both of y'all coming to do this talk today. And it's been, NFTs are such a hot and provocative topic, in the past couple of years. And it's been something that I definitely, shy away from being part of a dialogue and a conversation that has very polarizing views for a number of reasons, because there's very few certainties in this world that we have here. We know as much as we know at any given moment, and I really am thankful to both of y'all for having such balanced viewpoints and coming to talk about a thing, to talk about a thing that's existing and disrupting and changing, without having a soapbox to want to be on. There's been a lot of Clubhouse rooms and Twitter spaces and like different talks that are really coming from a very firm and like very serious, like, this is the position, this is the truth, this is what it is. And that kind of certainty to me is really dangerous, because it negates the possibility of change and fluidity. And this is, a very new thing that has the capacity to do a whole lot more than we could even conceptualize right now.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Within the scene as it's developing as it is right now, I think Aaron Cook had some good questions around. Would love to hear thoughts on anti-money laundering and avoiding funding terrorist organizations with these tools. And then maybe also to piggyback on that, interested in hearing the panel's thoughts on corporate NFTs as quick cash grabs versus actually empowering artists. So yeah, how do we work within the system as it is emerging right now?
So complicated. What was the first question again, Olivia? I think that one, I could start there.
Money laundering.
Money laundering.
Yeah.
Money laundering.
Yeah. An anti-terrorist or fund. How do we avoid funding?
How do we avoid that? I mean, I don't know, because it hasn't been avoided with major banks. We're still seeing banks being indicted for not, watching where that money is flowing or covering up where that money is going. That this is an age-old thing, and that's why when I talk about crypto culture, the history of encryption, there is nothing in that I'm describing that's like either for or against or taking an ethical position on that, because it's a neutral, a neutralist way of doing all kinds of things, right? So what is the power of anonymity, and what's the power of transparency? Both of those things are important at certain times and can be used both nefariously or to abuse humans further, or for revolutionary purposes to emancipate people. And I think some of the comments in the chat have pointed that out.
Ooh, I'll take the other side of that question. What can you repeat it, Olivia, about the corporate NFTs?
Yeah. What are the panel's thoughts on corporate NFTs as quick cash grabs versus actually empowering the artists?
I think I love advertising. Folks that know me know that I love it. I think it's the funniest psychology and communication of aesthetics industry in the world. I love participating in it, and I love it. I read about it. It's just hilarious and awesome to me. There's a sucker born every minute, right? So like if Popeyes wants to make an NFT and somebody's going to buy it, then they're going to do it, and I think that's not part of the art market. They're using the technology in their own way. It's not that NFTs are only for art. It's just a way to put a file in a system and create a transaction inside that system. Like it doesn't have to be one thing and it doesn't have to be the other thing. but it's, you know, I could get frustrated by it, or I could think it's hilarious. And I think it's hilarious. The same way I think it's hilarious when, you know, if you've ever gone to a store like Colette in Paris, and they'll have like, you know, a gold and diamond encrusted necklace with the logo of Facebook or something like that. And you're like, why does this exist? Who's going to buy this? You know, like there's a whole market and industry for that. And folks are going to rush to it, you know, like it's interesting. As I've gotten older, it's so similar to conversations that I had 10 years ago about brands on Twitter, you know, and they would be like, why is Chips Ahoy on Twitter? You know, like, it's like, because there's a dialogue there. There are people there talking, you know, and it's the same way, like, why are they on NFTs? Because there's people there shopping and they're brands, and that's what they do. So, you know, it's not a thing that I have a real, I don't know if that answers your questions or leaves you with more questions, but that's my feeling on it.
Yeah, it is sort of, I always wonder, you know, why does somebody buy a Coca-Cola t-shirt, you know?
Totally.
I don't know if that's a close example, but right.
Yeah. It means a lot to them, you know, like there are brands that are, you know, very personal to people, and everybody is allowed to identify with their own badges their own way.
Yeah. I have another question from Laura Dickens. A lot of the discussion seems to be about how artists are compensated and how they live. Why is there a discussion of ownership versus a discussion of what communities owe to artists and other solutions like UBI?
Oh, such a good point.
Yeah,
it's such a good point. I always, you know, I guess I'm a simplistic thinker in that I often go straight to the logical end of something, and it maybe is an interest of mine. What is the ultimate purpose of wealth? You know, especially given now that we have so many examples of people with such obscene wealth that, you know, nobody could ever use that much wealth. But what's the ultimate purpose? Is it food? Is it shelter? Is it, you know, security from different immunity, you know, relative immunity? And so I think oftentimes my mind goes there because artists they always have been so fraught on, you know, in that space of precarity and going without rent, you know, and going without paychecks and things like that. So I think that's why I was going there. And I think, Kim, your discussion about how you started to figure out how to make money and again, pay the bills. There is a large part of this discussion of NFTs that shifts over there, which is interesting.
For sure.
I think it's really, oh, go ahead, Kim, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, you know, UBI is like a whole other talk. You know, we should be talking about that, you know, not just for artists, but for all people, you know, because the truth is, like, you know, every person should have the time and the space to be creative. You know, that shouldn't be a privilege for those who can afford it, or for those who are deemed talented enough, or who have a voice that is important enough. You know, I wish we could get into that, but that's like another really massive topic. There are so many little tentacle topics inside of this that, you know, we could do another hour, but I'm not going to expect anybody to be on YouTube that long.
Yeah, and I don't actually see the two conversations as being mutually exclusive. You know, I think that you can talk about UBI and have conversations about ownership at the same time, because just because you do have a universal basic income doesn't mean that you shouldn't also have control over your production, right? And I think that is the real kind of core of this, is like control over production. That's what I think a lot of people see NFTs as granting them, as providing them. That's a little bit, again, that difference from existing structures and existing systems. And I think that there is there's a potential there that I think that is very attractive, is very appealing to folks, like that control, that sense of agency and control over their work. And UBI, whereas it grants you that kind of basic level of humanity, of being able to live, and I agree with Kim that everybody should have that access. It's not necessarily limited to artists, I think the question of ownership and the question of authorship is one that's can be very particular to artists and creatives, and it's one that our current infrastructure kind of leaves them kind of disenfranchised in that conversation in a way that NFTs tries to address.
I have one last question from Laura Dickens, who asked a lot of really good questions.
Really good.
I remember about 15 plus years ago, a lot of tech art world people were excited by freedom of information and the access brought on by a digital era. In music and art, etc., why is manufactured scarcity useful right now?
I love that. I love that question. Yeah. So good. You know, it's interesting because I feel like manufactured scarcity is a really provocative way of putting that, because it's not necessarily, you know, as an artist, I'm not necessarily manufacturing scarcity of something when I put it forward, and if I decide to sell it as an NFT, you know, it doesn't make it, to me, that is a collector to artist engagement of what I'm putting forward. It doesn't create a manufactured scarcity. It creates, you know, a bridge to the invisible that wasn't there before. So, you know, it's a difficult thing to wrap up, because, you know, have you guys, there's this really great project, speaking of manufactured scarcity, about like the robot arm that recreated, I think it's a Warhol sketch. And there was one original, and then, like, you know, 999 fakes. And I think that one's a really interesting thing, because it also talks about not just the scarcity of it, but the reality of it, you know, and where we draw some of those lines. And we're in such a like exciting gray area in this new web, in this new internet, in this new digital. And there's so much about, you know, the distinction of the control between what is free and what is not, you know, and it's an interesting thing to get to see out in the world, you know, digital artists that put things out in Creative Commons. And then they also have stuff that's like, you know, a minted NFT that's, you know, 5, 6, 7 figures. It's, you know, it's what the intention of the artist is with the specific piece of media. And the ability to designate that is a level of control, I think, in the digital world and as digital artists, that is absolutely vital for us to be able to have over our own work. You know, it's a really it's a special thing, and it's hard to wrap that all up into one thing. That's a great question that we'll be answering for a long time, I think.
Could you repeat the question? I just want to hear the first part of it.
Yeah. I remember about 15 plus years ago, a lot of tech art world people were excited by freedom of information and the access brought on by the digital era. In music, art, etc., why is manufactured scarcity useful now?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, manufactured scarcity, I think, is a really good way of putting it. But I think it's kind of like an ebb and flow, right? Of a sense of digital space that is explosive, that is, you know, expansive, and there's so much there. There's so much possibility. There's so much that's already being published and already kind of out there. And then this idea of uniqueness, right? Of unique codes, unique algorithms that are identifying like originality and specificity in a way that I think folks have taken for granted with digital media and with even digital art, I think, to some extent. So yeah, it's a really interesting kind of, I think of it as kind of a natural cyclical evolution of it's not necessarily supply and demand, but I think there is sort of a shift that's happening in that sense. Yeah, I'm gonna leave it there. You have to think about that a little bit more. That's a great question.
Yeah, I'm also of two minds about it, just because I don't want us to keep repeating these old ways of holding up private property as a way, you know, as a natural way of living, or as a way to assure our rights in a sense, you know. But I also don't want musicians and artists to keep being exploited, which they are, you know.
Right.
So I have, you know, the practical side of me that wants people to get paid, and again, to be able to eat and have shelter. But then the ethical part where, you know, everybody wants a utopia where we don't hurt each other for things. So, yeah.
All right. I think that's a sentiment to end on, unless y'all have further remarks or comments.
Well, this is great. Thank you so much for putting this together, Olivia. This has been awesome.
Yeah. Thank y'all for being here. Yeah, thank you, Delinda, Kim, Buki. Thank you, everyone in the chats. And we hope that this is the beginning of more conversations. There's a lot to talk about, as we discovered here. So thank you so much. If you want to go back to this will be archived on YouTube, so you can revisit